Welcome to our CS506 final project. My name is Chiron, and I'm here with Waiteng Singh, Vladimir, and Afolabi. And let's begin. So, with our initial project description, we wanted to investigate the relationship between economic conditions and movie performance, with a specific focus on horror movies. And we wanted to test the hypothesis that during economic downturns, horror movies not only increase in production, but also outperform other genres in terms of ROI. And a couple of our goals were to analyze the correlation between economic indicators such as the S&P 500, recession periods, and horror movie performance metrics such as box office revenue and return on investment. We also wanted to compare horror movie performance against other genres during economic downturns and identify patterns in horror movie production volume during these different economic cycles. Our main motivation for this idea was a couple of articles, this one specifically, which states that researchers analyzing box office trends found that during times of economic hardship, horror movies not only increased in production, but also outperformed other genres in terms of profitability. And this trend suggested a heightened demand for escapism mixed with the thrill of fear.
We sourced our data firstly from Kaggle, where we found a box office worldwide record that listed hundreds of films, all with their titles, release dates, budgets, revenues, even some popularity scores, and some user ratings, amongst other lots of features that we had. And we combined that with market data from the S&P 500, where we used the Y Finance Python library to give us a complete view of what the US equity market cycle looked like during the time periods that we had. So those were the two main data sets that we used to help us understand what the market climate was and what the movie climate was at every point in time. And to be able to utilize this data, we ran a lot of Python scripts, first to extrapolate just horror films, as we're running an analysis on just horror films first versus the S&P 500, until we realized that our data would be skewed due to the change in inflations. And so we had to bring in another data set, the consumer price index, and use that to normalize our data for inflation over the long periods of time. I think in our data set, we have movies and S&P 500 data needing to be normalized from around 1917 to 2017. So we needed to process this data to be as accurate as possible for our models. In this slide, you can see how we're able to adjust both the budget of those movies versus the revenue and compare how they change once adjusted for inflation along the years. The line along the middle would indicate where the adjusted budget and original budget met, and the color would indicate the year of the movie. So the more light green it is, the later it was released, and the more darker and purple it was, the older it was. We also, just to incorporate more of the data, the bigger the circle is, the higher the movie was rated. And we're just able to extract a lot of meaningful information from all the data that we processed.
We wanted to contextualize the data based on some questions raised from the midterm feedback, which were are certain genres more common in economic downturns, or is it simply the most produced genres overall? And as you can see right here in this table, we have the overall share and the hardship share. And some key takeaways were romance jumps from the 10% to 15% of the releases, the relative increase of 5.4%. This may suggest that studios appear to greenlight more romance titles during recessions. Comedy and horror both inch upwards, suggesting audiences favor escapism or catharsis during tough times. Action and science fiction shrink the most, consistent with their higher production budgets and greater financial risk. Drama remains the single biggest slice overall, but its share actually falls slightly in hardship months, showing that its apparent spike in raw counts is just a reflection of being the most dominant genre year-round. This baseline checks confirms that the genre shifts we observe in recession visualizations are real proportional changes, not just artifacts of drama's normal ubiquity. And this graph right here is basically just visualizing what I just talked about in the other chart of the hardship share versus, the overall share.
So we perform linear regression to examine the relationship between economic conditions and movie performance across all different genres. We created a normalized recession severity score of 0 and 1, where higher values indicate worse economic conditions. And we analyzed multiple genres, horror, comedy, drama, action, romance, science fiction, and the other genres to compare the performance during different economic conditions. And we generated a scatter plot with regression lines for each genre. So this is the scatter plot. On the left is return on investment, and the bottom is the economic hardship severity. And the next slide shows the result from yeah, a result table. So you could see that for horror, like horror movies show a negative relationship with economic hardship severity. This suggests that horror films tend to be less profitable during economic downturns. And among eight analyzed genres, horror ranks seven in terms of positive relationship with economic hardship. And two out of the genres show a positive relationship with economic hardship, suggesting that these genres may be recession resistant. Another statement from the source that we're trying to disprove or that we find is wrong is that it says during recession horror movies generate produce like more, but we found that it was not true. Like during recessions, on our hardship severity scale of above 0.5, drama, comedy, and thriller produce most of the movies.
We also used a KNN model to try and find just to correlate the relationship between S&P 500 close prices and the movies that were produced during the time. And what we found is that genres like fantasy, science fiction, adventure, for example, have a strong correlation with the S&P 500, the performance of the S&P 500. But horror movies didn't have as much of a correlation. So that again, going back to our hypothesis, we said that horror movies would possibly have the most correlation. But when we just look at the general trends with SP 500 and movie genres, it's one of the lowest from this chart.
We also tried using a random forest model to use the features of the movie produced during that period to predict whether or not there's a recession or not. And then our model had a decent accuracy of 73%. And we could see that the ranking different features of from their importance, like drama, comedy, and action, is the most is a better indicator than horror. Yeah, so horror films rank relatively low in importance behind genres such as science fiction and romance. Yeah, this finding is uh, notable given our initial hypothesis about horror films. The data suggests that horror may not be as recession-proof as it sometimes claims.
Yeah, so initially from our results, we kind of were getting towards some information. Ultimately, we kind of realized that horror movies didn't really have that much correlation, like at all, in regards in general with SPA 500, and also like just during recession periods. So from this initial preliminary results, this is when we started doing more exploration of the data. We used random forest and whatnot compared to our midterm, like at the point where we're at the midterm. So our final result, we basically ultimately came to the conclusion that horror movies really don't have any correlation at all with the S&P 500 and the general economic performance in the United States. But we found genres like romance, drama, and fantasy to have more of a correlation. And if especially the drama genre, we found that it was the most recession correlated genre from all the models that we used to validate the data. And we conclude that it could be an indicator of the performance of the economy. And it's possible if we use stuff like decision trees or neural networks, we could have made some additional conclusions. But yeah, ultimately, yeah, those were our findings from our project.